Hello. Hello.
Hi.
Just a minute. I'm just taking the stickers off my phone, which is my high-tech security.
I'm
How are
glad,
you?
glad to hear other people do things like that as well.
Yeah, it's hack-proof. Your camera is the wrong way. That's
So
it.
okay,
It's all right. I knew this was coming.
okay, we're going to switch now. We're going to switch onto an iPad now.
No, we're
Hello,
gonna...
Gavin.
Oh, we're going to tape it to an iPad.
Yeah.
All right. Okay.
Hiya.
We're going to go high tech.
We're going high tech too.
Oh, wow. How are you doing over there? It's a little bit stormy over here.
Well, it's been quite stormy. We're just recovering from COVID. We've got the full gamut of excitements going on. So yeah.
Oh, no.
We've got the dog helping by sitting.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah. Well, I love that. I mean, non-human contributor to the session is just perfect.
Now, is that good? That looks...
Hold on.
Does that look okay for you, Melissa?
We're not quite both on it, are we really?
I can hear you perfectly. I think that's the main thing. I can't see your heads at the moment, but I think you need to tilt it a little bit downwards. There we go.
A little bit better.
You're just about in. You're in and out. There we are.
That way, isn't it?
That's it.
Where's that lamp? Doesn't really matter, does it?
So while we're getting warmed up here, remind everyone where you are in the UK.
So we're right in the middle of the UK. We're in Derbyshire. We're south of Manchester, north of Birmingham, and it rains a lot. So yeah, that's why we've got good tree growth. So that's important. So yes, that's where we are. Can you see us? Can you see us a little bit better now?
I can, yeah, and I can hear the high-tech equipment. I can hear there's some sellotape or something sticking the camera.
It is. It's very, very good tape. This is green tape, good for decorating. Yes.
I'm loving the analog. I am. This is a hybrid of analog meets high-tech here. Well, brilliant. Yeah. So we're a minute off. So it's really great to speak to you again. For the audience, we have had a long chat, haven't we? So I'm pretty familiar with what you do, and I think that today's session will be really interesting. I'm sure that everyone's going to find what you have to share really interesting. So first of all, I thought we'd kick off with the question: how did you get involved in growing the future?
That's good to see that.
Yeah, nice easy one there to start with. Well, I guess there's been a sort of few seeds sown for it, that kind of came together. There was the sort of first seed was my parents had bonsai trees, but with two young kids, you're not getting much gardening done. And one of them had overgrown, and in the winter, when the leaves were off, I sort of remember looking up at it, and it looked like a throne. And it was a beautiful kind of image that stuck in my head. I had plenty of time to think about it later. I've spent most of my childhood in and out of hospital correcting a spinal problem, and but I had a while in a really beautiful mid-century sort of designed hospital where the wards were sort of built into the woodland like a sort of star shape. So from my bed, I could see out into the woods, and you can imagine how many bird feeders and things there were and what have you. And at the same time, I sort of had the opportunity to, well, because there's not much to do when you're in hospital other than watch what's going on. But I was really, really impressed with how kind, competent and considerate all the staff were. And, there was a sort of realization that whatever I wanted to do when I grew up, I wanted to be, as good as them, and but also somehow with nature involved. And when I went to university to study furniture design after a couple of years of art college, there was a really interesting moment of sort of learning about materials, learning that wood is, solid air, soil, and sunshine. And that kind of changed how I thought about the material. But there was also a project where it was really about kind of recycling at that time. This is sort of mid 90s, but hit me that the project was looking into the life cycle of a Coke can, and how much, you know, time, energy goes into, you know, sourcing those materials. What happens to the people, you know, in the mines? Are there, you know, is everybody kind of willing workers in those mines? Getting the, you know, growing the sugar and sugar plantations and all those things that we do to the natural world and to each other in order to get that kind of Coke can. And then the fact that, you know, you drink it and throw it away, and it just seemed to really sum up quite a lot of humans' interactions with the world. And yeah, I got quite interested in how can, once you see that and then looking around at how everything else is made, it was kind of like, oh my God, what are we doing? You know, this is outrageous. And then the kind of final seed was, I was living in California, very happily making driftwood furniture on the beach, and it was great going down to the beach, going shopping for, you know, bits and bobs. And I was making chairs and tables and things by stitching the furniture back, the driftwood back together, and then planing the outer edges. And I'd met some people, a guy called Dr. Chris Cattle, who was growing stools, and I'd heard about other people doing similar things. And there was a bit of a kind of eureka moment, thinking, oh my God, it'd be easier to grow the tree into the shape that we want. And actually, you know, I need to get on with it. How hard can that be? And 15 years later, now we know how hard it is. But that's the kind of, you know, the underlying story of what got this going. So, you know, but coming back to the UK, having the opportunity to have some land to practice on, Alice saying, okay, let's go for it, and her kind of influence outside of, you know, for me, it was mostly kind of manufacturing type things, but actually the way the world is that everything's connected to everything else. So Alice bringing her kind of wider vision of how the world works really kind of helped that, help the project get going, really. So
brilliant. Yeah. So it was a number of events, wasn't it, over a period of years?
Yeah.
And I find that's a very common theme in this general area. It's not that you suddenly have an epiphany and the light bulb. It's an organic process wherein one thing is happening and another, and then you're joining the dots and thinking, I need to approach it differently, which in this case is a systemic way of producing, you know, producing furniture. But obviously that's, you've started with furniture, haven't you? But I know you've created lamps as well. So, you know, what would you, what do you think of as the sort of the scope of what you can grow at Fullgrown? How big or small can we go?
Well, I think it's about kind of, we've started with chairs because that's, you know, as a furniture designer, and chairs and sculptures and lamps, because that's my kind of background. That's what I'm familiar with. But I think the sky's the limit with what we can do. It's a kind of, you know, we're developing a sort of 3D printing type process. And actually it's not so much that we're growing chairs, where what we're doing is we're altering and creating ecosystems that produce chairs. So actually it's about creating ecosystems and environments in which structures can be grown. So actually kind of looking at it in that kind of way, then actually, you know, I think that it would be great to be able to grow self-contained environments and habitats, and, you know, so that we can actually kind of have the least impact on the natural world, but yeah, by creating sort of, you know, structures and environments. So actually, I think it's to the beginning of a very long journey that will take multiple generations.
When you were saying about creating basically a closed system as opposed to an open system, and I think that difference is something that's often lost by a lot of those that are first coming to biodesign and biosystems, It's the fact that the minute that you start, if you like, making interventions in an ecosystem, whether or not it's planting more particular species of trees or less or whatever it is, you're creating a catalyst, and that can be for good or bad. But one of the things I thought of when we had the very bad storms a couple of weeks ago, my first thought was to your furniture orchard. Did you suffer any losses in the storm, or did the orchard come off unscathed?
One of the things that we have got right from the beginning, fingers crossed, touch wood, you know, obviously we don't want to go to the field tomorrow and find out is that we've got a system in place that takes into account prevailing wind is always, you know, going to be going that way, but actually damage happens when there's a storm and wind blows from another direction. So we've got a kind of system set in place that if that does happen, then, and there are branches broken, then they'll break outside of the production zone and sort of, you know, break up there out of the way where it's okay. And then we can prune them if need be. And it's been 15 years now and 10 years of that actual field. And we've broken one branch from a storm, and that could have been the dog.
Wow.
It's quite low down.
Incredible. That is incredible.
So actually, yeah, in the scheme of things, that's a definite success. But
and that shows the art in your R&D, and that, you know, when you started out, that, you know, was that something you thought of and that you planned for at the outset when you were planting the orchard, or did you realize that over a process of time?
That's one of the few things that I knew from the beginning that I really needed to do and get right, and knowing that trees, you know, at the bottom, you know, when they're sort of blowing like that, they're not going to move that far at the bottom, but near the top they'll move quite a lot. So the framing system that we have allows for that to happen, and that was something from the beginning. So thanks for asking a question. I'm proud of the answer.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. And thinking to the sort of risks that you face more generally with the furniture orchard, you know, what would you say are the other major threats? I mean, would you say that, for example, insect infestations are a major threat, or could be, or do you feel that you've mitigated that through other steps that you've taken to protect the orchard?
Well, we did start out with the idea of it being a sort of very tidy vineyard, and actually, you know, we've had lots of wonderful advice from people of how to deal with pests and problems and stuff. And actually, we've got a you know, so one of the pests is caterpillars that come and eat the trees. So by having birds' nests all the way along everywhere, and quite often they grow in the chairs and the lambs, it's beautiful. Then the birds come and eat the caterpillars, which can strip a tree in a day. So that's what we were saying really about the ecosystem idea of creating. You know, having the birds are helpful to get rid of the pests, sort of thing. So we can make it nice for them, then they can, you know, do that job. And we've had sort of several generations of birds living.
Yeah, the wilder it is, it seems the healthier it is. I mean, the whole rewilding, it's quite a buzzword at the minute, but it has really helped us. So a very organised gardener's style of situation, which we had early on, really, it's so much healthier without that massive intervention. The less we intervene, the better it seems to be. I was going to mention ash dieback and woodworm though.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you've heard of ash dieback.
Yes,
which is it hasn't devastated our plans because we saw it was coming, so we didn't put so much weight on ash trees. But one of the things we hadn't really understood was that woodworm loves ash, so all of the ash dying has brought a lot more woodworm to us, which has you know, it's another learning curve of things we didn't really know so that was a bit of an interesting few discoveries of a few different sections of woodworm. So that was interesting. I think one of the things is we don't know what we don't know in so many circumstances. So as we learn that we need to be wilder to encourage the ecosystem and the biosystem, we find out a whole new lesson after that. It's such a huge learning curve, really, on so many planes.
Yeah, definitely. We've got a front row seat of what's actually going on when humans interact with the natural world, as it were, and yeah, sometimes it's quite exciting. and there's a reason that humans have spent thousands and thousands of years protecting ourselves from the vagaries of and the disasters of nature, but yeah, you can go too far in that direction as well, obviously. So
it's wonderful to hear you speaking to that, because often a lot of the work that is done in this general growing with nature space is in a lab. It's in a closed environment, which obviously things can go in a way that is unintended in that environment, but when you put it into an open system, the outdoors, it's a much bigger range of possibilities. And it's really wonderful to hear that just as in the natural world, the greater the diversity of species, the greater the integrity of the furniture orchard. That's, I mean, in some ways it's completely logical, but then in other ways that's at odds with the sort of industrial farming, isn't it? Because industrial farming of crops, including fruit crops, has historically involved a lot of pesticides, or at least, the last several decades, industrial farming, and you're stripping it back to that more, well, effectively an organic way of, I would say not farming, but of producing what it is that you produce.
Yeah, I mean, we did sort of start out that way, in a sort of traditional concept sort of thing, but so I guess in some ways we're lucky enough to have seen both sides of that, and while we're not scientists with clipboards, as it were, studying everything that's happened, it's very, very clear that by allowing it to be an ecosystem rather than pesticides and preventing things and mowing and everything, actually it definitely brings healthier environment. And the thing is that's trees don't naturally grow into chairs, but they can certainly kind of go in the right direction, and if they're healthy and cared for, then actually they're more willing is not quite the right word, but you know what I mean, it's easier to do, and they definitely will tell you if they're not giving permission for what you're doing, for sure. So yeah, actually by doing less we can achieve more in some circumstances. So, and
I was thinking, as you work with trees, I mean that's your principal medium, isn't it, or co-creator, you might say. Do you find yourself, some people might go around an art gallery and find inspiration. Do you find yourself, as you're driving through the countryside, spotting a tree that has naturally formed a shape and feeling inspiration, or does that not happen?
Oh,
I try to keep my eyes on the road and try to keep both of our eyes on the road. But yes, we do. There's a lot to see, and the more your eyes tune into what's going on in the natural world, the more easily you are distracted while driving. So
yeah, that definitely happens. It's definitely got to be careful of it. But yeah, it's nice to be able to see. We can look at trees now and sort of see what happened for the last 70 years in that spot or whatever, or it's easier to kind of read the environment and stuff. And no, I'm not saying we've got it right or anything, but it's quite nice to sort of be connected a little bit for that.
Yeah, your eyes and your brain sort of switch into a different sort of direction. In some ways, you start to concentrate on different aspects that you might have ignored if you were just seeing trees as part of the furniture sort of thing. But if you're starting to see their potential, then you start to look at them in a different way.
We've been doing quite a few workshops over the last sort of year or two, and it's been amazing seeing other people look at trees differently, as it were. Lots of students, and that's been a really interesting part of it. Is sort of seeing, there's been as many different reactions as people that have done the workshops. It's really cool. So yeah, not looking at trees in the same way again is definitely something we'd like to put out there.
And it struck me that one of the things that in my work I think about a lot, because it's a primary source of data, is the fact that through tree rings we have a record of the environment, and obviously the older the tree, the longer the record. And what's, you know, very different about what you're producing is usually when something is produced in a factory or even in a designer studio, it's of the moment. There will be no record as such in that piece. It will really tell you very little about the environment, but in your works, they themselves are in effect a record of the environment for how long they've been growing. So they are this sort of living information system of what was happening within the weather cycles. Do you find that, as would happen, let's say in an oak tree, there's much variance in the tree rings and in the growth and in all the sort of decrease in growth if it's a poor season? Do you see much of that in the tree rings and how the plants are growing or not?
Oh, totally. Yeah, it's one of the nice things about the chair designs is now we grow them upside down, that the sort of trunk enters at the back of the chair. So actually on the back of the chair you can see and count those rings, and you can see what a dry year,
a windy year, all sorts of
even a windy year.
Yeah, like more vibrations on the tree, so it's a bit of a stronger
as the trees blow, they kind of like tense themselves, sort of thing. So that's why, you know, trees by the edge of a field or something, when they're on their own, they tend to be thicker because they're more, you know, they've been buffeted by the wind a lot more. So yeah, it's really some of the first ones we harvested and then polished them, you know, so you could see the rings. It was really like, oh my god, it's
really nice part of it, isn't it?
Yeah, it doesn't always work out how you think it will. So when it does and it's better, it's great. So that the tree rings is beautiful, actually.
And I was, you know, wondering what have been, you know, it's 15 years, isn't it, since you started out?
Yeah.
What along that journey have been the biggest surprises in working with trees to create furniture?
Well, the birds nesting in that lamp in 2014 or whatever, that was, it's not exactly a surprise, but the fact that it was a surprise. It was amazing. It was like that the dream of collaborating with nature and was actually becoming a reality. That was really nice surprise, to be liked by birds, as it were, for their home.
I think one of the things, in perhaps a less positive surprise, is that we thought that once we'd found some rules for a certain species of tree, then perhaps the other tree, it might give us a little blueprint or a little hint of the direction that that trees generically might go in. But actually each species is different. Each species makes up their own rules. I'm not going to do what a willow does. I'm a beech, don't you know? And I don't know. That's I think naively we thought we might have more rules by now, but I think that
we're at the point of realizing just how much there is to know and how many things we're actually doing that humans haven't done before, even though there's, you know, almost all the techniques that we use we could have done before agriculture. You know, there's nothing kind of clever on that front, but at the same time, there's, when we do the grafting and things, for example, you know, normally people have been grafting treetops onto rootstock, you know, with vineyards and fruit trees and things, but normally you want to, those four elements, you know, the two tops and the two bottoms, you want to just keep the top of one and the bottom of another. But for us, we want to keep all four of those parts alive. And I mean, there might be humans that are doing it somewhere, but I haven't found them. And so actually, some of the techniques that we're using have brought about things that we've not done before, and that's a bit of a surprise, just how much there is to know about that and what are the reactions and what have you. So yeah, it's sort of, I think at the beginning we thought that doing something to a tree, we'd find out whether we'd done well in 2 or 3 years time, but actually after 3 years something else happens, and 4 years, you know, actually trees, they don't move around, they're not as still as we think they are. They certainly move around a lot, and there's a lot more going on with them than we knew. So we've come to realise that we're just on the tip of an enormous iceberg with tons and tons of potential. But wow, is there a lot to know?
I mean, you know, the amazing thing is it does feel as a practice something primal. And there are, I mean, the closest analogy I can think of is the living root bridges of India. But even that is, that's a sort of more straightforward concept than this, in that the way in which those roots weave to make the bridge can be a lot, you know, a lot more diversified than what you need in order to make a chair that someone can sit on and not break. Because effectively you're making a work of engineering, aren't you? You're co-creating with nature to engineer a chair.
Yeah.
So, you know, it feels old and yet it is right at the edge. So you're sort of, the fact that you've thought of this, it's, you know, this feels like something we could have discovered, let's say, in Neolithic Britain, but it's innovated by you, literally.
Well, yeah. Careful what you wish for.
yeah. You never know. We may find some ruins, but I think if we were to find some artifacts, the thing is, if it had been invented, I think it would have continued. So I think the fact it's definitely new. I think.
Well, people have done all sorts of similar things. To be fair, you know, the Chinese, I think it was in the Ming period. There was a digging holes. Massive holes, filling those holes with carefully placed and shaped rocks, and then growing the roots through them but I mean, if you think what we do is a lot of work, that's an enormous amount of effort and stuff. So there's definitely, people have dabbled around the edges of it, and they've done what we're doing. We're just trying to make it into a repeatable process. So yeah, I can't claim
different
innovation.
same general approach, but a different application of the process.
Yeah, but we also see why it's so difficult. I mean, you know, why people haven't done it.
They may not have had your endurance. They may have given it a go, didn't they?
Yeah, it definitely requires endurance. Yeah.
And you know, the other thing that it struck me is a lot of people speak about the slow movement, slow travel, slow design. I mean, this really is slow design, isn't it? How long does it take you to create a piece from beginning to end?
So for a chair, it's best to allow for at least a decade, because there's, you know, you've got to kind of grow the shape that you want. There's the grafting of everything together so that it becomes one piece, and then when you coppice it, there's another, you know, with a chair, for example, there's another year of drying it carefully, because you know, you don't want it to kind of move and shift, you know, after 9 years of effort. So yeah, it does take a while, but it also, in some ways, in order to get an object, a wooden structure or a wooden object, it's actually kind of quicker from having nothing to a finished object, because we grow trees for 50 years before cutting them down and making them into small bits. So in some ways it's actually faster.
And
but,
and also, I mean, we feel it's quite slow when we were looking at it from the outside, but apparently it takes that long to design a car and bring it to production. So even in the whole, we feel we're doing something quite slowly, but if you go to a major car manufacturer and start a car starting from now, we could race them, and perhaps we'd grow a chair more quickly. Who knows? Yeah, perhaps we'll not put that challenge out there, but you know, it's a possibility. There are things. I mean, lots more. Yeah.
I mean, it is interesting to look at it in that kind of like, it's quicker from having nothing to a finished object, but yeah, it still does take a while to do, and you know, yeah, it's going to take further development to do it, but you know.
So it just struck me then that, you know, another quality, if you like, of biodesign, biomaterials, biocomputing and so forth, is that processes that historically were siloed, they were separate. So speaking to the design of a car obviously first you might think about the aerodynamics, you might think about the reason that you're designing it differently. Let's say, you know, you're going to make it more fuel efficient. Then obviously you take it through the R&D process, which in itself is broken down to further steps. Whereas your process is, if you like, it's amalgamated in the sense that the design and the engineering and the production process is all happening at the same time, isn't it? It's sort of integrated.
Yeah, yeah, which is occasionally brilliant and occasionally challenging, as it were. But yeah, it's going to be a while. You know, actually, it's sort of, yeah, it's still a little way from actually kind of it being a known activity. That's the thing. It's still, there's still more kind of research and development to do, but yeah, it is challenging to know that what you did today, you're not going to know the effect of for a decade. That has its special, you know, there's a connection to nature, and then a bit more, as it were.
And you know, I was thinking to the future, as it were, of where this might go, and you know, along timelines of 10, 20, 30, 40 years. How do you imagine the kind of this space of interspecies collaboration, be it with plants or be it with animals, or as in your case, a whole ecosystem effectively, isn't it? The furniture orchard is an ecosystem. Where do you see this going? When you visualize what that might look like, what are your thoughts?
All right, shall I?
Well, we have no idea how it's going to develop beyond our lifetimes, but for me, I'm very keen on having wildlife being part of production of everyday objects. But Gavin has some slightly more extravagant thoughts about where it could potentially end up. But this is a long, a few generations, a few millennia.
I have to admit the dream really is actually a few millennia ahead, and
we are far thinking here.
Yeah, I'm definitely a big fan of history and ancient history and big time scales. So actually, for me personally, the vision is a massive party celebrating 1,000 years of peace in a and we've grown space habitats that can survive off planet comfortably, and with, you know, and the vision really is sort of everyone's come back for a big party back to Earth, and this project is just trying to work backwards from there. So you know, talking about chairs and lamps is one thing, but in some ways, actually, we're thinking really far ahead and trying to work back from there. So
I just have a question here, actually. So we have a question. What species are you growing? What species says, could I ask what species is the fastest growing chair?
Oh.
So fastest growing, mostly we've started with willow, and so most of the things that you will have seen already have been grown with willow, but fast isn't necessarily the best thing, because the density of the wood might not be strong enough to support a person, for example, on a chair or something like that. And we had some beautiful successes with ash, but as we've already discussed, ash dieback has it's
a real shame. It's a perfect chair growing tree. But anyway,
so we've got ash, and then we've had some hazel, some beech, some sycamore, some apple. Cherry wasn't so good. Oak is not necessarily happy with it, but we're trying it because everybody wants oak. But there's so much potential, and so we've used UK hedgerow species to start off with, but there's a lot more that we'd like to try. And we've just gone with UK species to start off with because we know that they'll be happy in the environment. We don't have to make a slightly false environment for things to grow, because you can imagine, oh yes, well, let's use some Ficus elastica. We're going to have to really cosset that on our Derbyshire hillside. It's not going to be happy. It's not going to be robust enough to withstand any of those things. So for UK focused things, we're using UK species, native and naturalized, but you know, the world is huge, and there are so many diverse trees out there, and we don't know what the potential could be. There are so many things that we could use. There's a lot we'd really like to go into, with, you know, with things like quince. I'm absolutely obsessed with the thought of some quince growing into some kind of furniture. But there's a huge amount of potential, and we've only got one life, so we've just got to get on and plant some more trees, it looks like. But
it seems to be, the idea is adapting there's certain types of trees in hopefully in most environments that are already growing there, and if we can kind of adapt those, sometimes you want faster growing, sometimes you want slower growing. The fast growing thing is a bit of a misnomer, really, because they move more, and you know, it looks like you've got the shape you wanted, and then in the last couple of years it will push out. So it's actually different types of trees are different. You know, a dining table would probably be better in one species, and a lamp in another, and we're just at the beginning of learning these things. So, but it's it's a nice part of it, actually. That I like that.
I have a slightly selfish question. So in my research on the fire side, I look at the fire cycles of California, and the fire regimes, which you'll, I'm sure, know, have different frequencies. So you have the fast, if you like, the low intensity, but the very frequent fire regime, which essentially it burns usually just through the sort of the grasses and the brush, but it doesn't usually damage the trees. And then you have the high intensity, which essentially incinerates everything. And then you have the mix, the sort of intermediate. And one of the sort of propositions of that is actually building with the fire cycles, but at the level of materiality, completely making the habitat, completely making the buildings out of natural materials. The reason being that obviously when fire turns the materials into debris, that debris turns, if it's synthetic, into microplastics, which then pollute the environment, the streams, ends up in the ocean and so forth. And I'm wondering, you know, could, let's say it was a fire regime, the sort of intermediate, you could be looking at around sort of 15 to 20 years cyclicality of that fire regime. Do you see it in the future as being possible, if not in practice, in theory, that you could, if you like, curate the cyclicality of the furniture being grown with the fire regimes, and so that when the fire burns everything to the ground, you actually you grow the next generation? Do you think that is possible, or do you think that's a little bit out there?
I don't know. I mean, considering everything I've just been talking about, I've not want to speak about out there, but I think you know, with the fire thing, when we mentioned this before, and I've been pondering about it, and I can't see how you wouldn't lose a few things that are kind of not quite ready yet, but at the same time, I don't see any reason why you couldn't. And perhaps it might be kind of bigger structures, or slightly bigger and slightly smaller, to take into account, you know. So I don't know. I'd love an extra lifetime to research
that.
Yeah. But,
or some extra funding to set up another research project.
Yeah. But it's definitely that sort of thinking, though. That's the thing. It's like, you know, it's kind of
that's eucalyptus and cork oak.
There's some really good.
And who knows?
Yeah. And they're both the inverse, because obviously the eucalyptus is highly flammable. Well, it's not flammable to itself, because it creates that blasts away essentially the energy to protect itself. But the cork oak is really resilient. Absolutely. It's basically fireproof. So
what it does highlight actually is a really good point, is the fact that, you know, if you're burning kind of man-made stuff, then obviously you end up with the microplastics and awfulness. But if you've got as many natural materials as possible, and the way that we're trying to build the orchard, taking that into account, then actually anything that's burnt or is wasted makes soil. And if there's anything one of the major things we've realized doing this project actually is that our responsibility, your responsibility, everybody's responsibility really is to make soil. You know, no matter what human beings have done, we're ultimately dependent on 6 inches of topsoil and the fact that it rains. And and actually, soil's really, really important. It's not about, we're not so much shaping trees as creating soil and an environment that the trees can grow in. And so, yeah, I can imagine, you know, the sort of California forest fires when they're kind of on a regular, you know, in a way that's more like how it used to be before humans got involved. I can imagine really fertile soil coming out of that. So yeah, absolutely.
Well, I know we use the ash from our fire. We put it on our compost heap as part of the process of making the compost. So yeah, it could be integrated in a cyclic way. So speaking of species, one thing I wondered if you thought about is obviously genetic engineering of plants, synthetic adaptations. Have you thought about working with genetically modified trees? And if you have, what would be the dream properties that you might integrate?
Well, I've got a friend who's got a dream that we could that you could plant a seed that grows a tent in an hour. It's one of Rob's things. Yeah, I have to admit, I could, well, as you might imagine, get quite carried away with that one, and it's one thing kind of thinking about growing chest of drawers, let alone, you know, altering genetic things. I think I personally feel like I don't know enough yet. I think we're starting to realise how much there is to know, and what we're doing. One of the things about thinking like a tree, or you know, the project in general, is what are the consequences of your actions when you do this, and once you start getting involved with genetics, then I've no idea what the consequences would be. So for me personally, I keep it in sort of fantasy thoughts of how it could be cool.
I think the thing is we're manipulating these wonderful organisms enough already, and we still don't know the potential of that. So adding in a whole new potential of, oh, this is genetically modified and you can wish for it whatever you want. I mean, there's still so much that we don't know of what we already know, if you see what I mean. So nicking and notching and grafting and all of those things, that we're still in the infancy of our manipulation of them. So I feel I personally haven't gone that far, but yeah.
I think we did bump into Flora Robotica, who were really interesting. And actually, I've dared to think about this a bit more so I could say it in public a little bit easier. But I could imagine that instead of, because what we're trying to do is have the most subtle interaction with nature in order to get the objects that we want. That's the whole point of the project. And actually the tools and materials that we use, we're trying to keep as simple as possible, and to the point where actually we could have almost everything that we need for the project to be, you know, Neolithic, and then, you know, a laptop and an iPhone and a 3D printer or something, and that's just enough. But what Flora Robotica kind of opened my eyes to was the fact that you could possibly, theoretically, one day, probably past our lifetime, have, you know, I could imagine tiny little robots covering up the shade of the little buds and stuff, and using something external to keep the natural thing going that we're trying to do, rather than sort of delving in there chemically, if you know what I mean. But yeah, like we've been saying, there's more than enough to do with what we've already got. So yeah, and I don't know what the consequences are of what I just said there. Do you know what I mean? Like, who knows? Yeah. I can imagine it being cool, sounding cool.
I think it's really important that you take that approach, because we see there was it was around about sort of several years ago, there were a number of projects coming out of the States where I think it's fair to state that the research regulations are rather looser than in the UK and in Europe, that were modifying trees. And one of them that really gained traction in the press and media and still even gets a lot of attention today is the idea of glowing trees, glowing where they spliced up some bioluminescent organisms or fluorescent organisms, presumably from fungi or something, with a tree. And what the project shows was that there was no consciousness on the part of the creators of the fact that obviously all species, except for those that dwell in caves or the very deep ocean, are either adapted to day or to night, and to the cyclicality, their circadian rhythms, their entire biology. And so if you start creating artificial light, be it from a computer screen, street lights, or a glowing tree, you're actually going to potentially harm the environment. And then, of course, you've got the fact that another, and this seems very pertinent now, historically, when war comes, even though there are technologies that today could create night vision and so forth, you have blackouts. And so, you know, if you go splicing up a tree with bioluminescent organisms and you can't turn the tree off in the same way that you can cut the power on a street light, then you potentially have a problem. And that, you know, that is part of a class of projects that, although getting a lot of press attention, just haven't thought about the implications. And everything that you've been saying, you know, effectively you've been speaking to the trade-offs that evolution makes, and to the fact that you can't be all things, be you an animal or a plant, and you have to choose one or the other, don't you? You were saying about the tree species all work very differently. They all have their preferences, and then they all respond to that differently. So I think it's an incredibly important point, you know, to the futures conversation, that we just don't know enough to be tinkering in certain areas yet.
Yeah, we're definitely trying to change the environment as little as possible. That's the thing. I mean, we're all kind of grown up, you know, in a sort of agricultural world where, you know, humans, we say, this is what we're doing to this bit of land, you know, and actually, yeah, this project is a step back from that. What is the least we can do? What is the least damage? What's the most subtle thing? And still have a good time, and, you know, and eat well and have comfy chairs. But, you know, but yeah, it's kind of, yeah, what's the least we can do rather than what's the most. But yeah.
And one of the things that we spoke about when we had a chat was the fact that in all of the biodesign space and biomaking in general, there is this sort of question of how it scales. So in some cases, it might be that it's scaling at the micro scale. There's a lot of, particularly with biomaterials, there's a lot of people, you know, using recipes to create them in their home, in their kitchen and so on. Then you've got companies like Biome that are actually scaling this to factories where you grow insulation panels and such like on a mass scale. And then you've got everything in between. When you think to the future of your particular area of growing furniture, how do you see that as being something that would be ubiquitously at one scale, or do you see that being a very mixed sort of futures where you've got the small and the large and it all going on? How do you visualize that?
I can personally see this working. Well, obviously, I've gone beyond the global thing with what we can.
Yeah, you've gone off planet.
Yeah, you know, we're thinking about leaving that and so the planet can get on with its own thing. But I can see this working everywhere. You know, that trees can grow, and on a kind of individual scale, in, you know, one tree in the back of somebody's garden to you know a kind of adapting. That there's lots of environments that are already, I mean, one of the things that I personally love to be able to do is, you know, is to grow furniture around the edges of hospitals. So, you know, like sycamore and things, some species are, you know, it's not biologically inert, antibacterial. And
you give me a thought there.
All right.
We need to speak to your man, Jason, BDP. The architectural firm BDP, they have been doing a lot of research this past several years into how the external environment actually affects, among other things, child recovery in hospitals. They had a major project where the entire architectural schema was designed around optimizing, if you like, the biophilic properties of being in the ward. So I think we need to chat there, because I do think that is a concept that in commercial arena there would most definitely be, I think, interest. It would be BDP. We've actually got Andrew Grant of Grant Associates from Gardens of Singapore fame is going to be joining us towards the end of this month. And obviously Grant Associates, again, do a lot of work in that space. So although that might sound a bit out there, I think that's definitely something that we can get some people together, have a chat about, and if nothing else, just publish a paper. But hey, you never know. I think you're speaking in the language that would definitely interest them.
Well, we're seeing Jason tomorrow, so we shall pass that on if we can get a word in edgeways. So that's brilliant. Yeah, lovely ideas there. Thank you.
Sorry.
Well, so Gavin was talking about how he'd like to have growth of furniture around hospitals. I feel that we have so much motorway infrastructure is what we have currently. I feel that there's potential for us to grow things and have wildlife corridors all along the edges of motorways. I feel like I'm having such small little ambitions compared to Gavin's larger ones. But yeah, I'm so much about the wildlife and the preservation of what little we have left, and trying to keep that going. So I feel that if we can have a more subtle interaction and we can sustain humanity with what we have, and the ideas of using growing furniture or objects that we need, if we can have less of an impact on the world, I feel that's a much more positive step for humanity than so many of the other things we can have. So yes, we'd like it to be as far as we possibly can get it, and also trying to get people to think about nature in a slightly different way, because we're so domineering of what can we do and how can we conquer nature, and there's so much more potential if we could just sort of work better with what we have. Really, that's
definitely. It's kind of trying to kind of conquer and dominate the natural world is clearly brought us to all the problems we have. We don't need to go into too much sort of thing, but
zoonotic diseases, I don't think we need any more of those at the minute.
But yeah, in terms of scaling the project, there's an awful lot of in between environments, like along the edges of motorways and things, and around buildings and hospitals, and that where actually humans are here. It's not going to be, it's not wild woodland or what have you, but the ecosystems that we can kind of create to grow the things that we've got can work really well. And there's tons of kind of in between space that humans have made that isn't definitely not the natural world anymore, but is perfect for this project to fit into. So yeah, one day I can definitely see this being this is how people make objects, and nobody batting an eyelid. It's and people will have had heirlooms of objects that have lasted for hundreds of years and what have you, because there's nothing to come apart in the way these structures work. So yeah, it's I could see this being ubiquitous one day for sure. But
and I think what you're speaking to, I mean, many people don't realize that a lot of the world that is inhabited by humans, particularly Britain, you would actually be hard pushed to find an area of Britain, except for maybe Snowdonia or up in the Highlands, that isn't heavily augmented by humans, because although sometimes what people think of as a natural landscape has actually been terraformed by humans back to the Neolithic and before, be that raising forest to the ground for wood or for hunting or whatever it was. And so Britain actually, as the greater part of Britain, is not natural per se. It's essentially gardened, but obviously how it's gardened at the moment has led to biodiversity poverty. It's led to many species struggling because they don't have enough habitat. And I think what you're speaking to is exactly the sort of hybrid that we need, and that you're looking at space optimization. Obviously, space is another major problem. You're looking at ideas that help to absorb precipitation, therefore help to mitigate flooding. You're looking at ideas that help, as you said, with your bird's nest, to provide wildlife habitat that look great. We know from studies of how trees in the environment actually affect everything from crime levels to health, you name it, all the good stuff trees are creating. So I think that your vision is absolutely in line with really what all of the key thinkers in this space are you know, looking towards in terms of how we make not just Britain but the whole world a much better place for humans and wildlife. It's absolutely online with that.
That's great to hear.
Mm. And there's also the fact of phyto remediation, so the growing trees in polluted. I mean, we've only polluted a large proportion of our land mass. So if we can help clean that by producing things from that sort of situation, we had some talks with some people in Rotterdam about growing things in areas that have been really heavily polluted in the docklands and that sort of thing. And I think that there's so much potential for so many useful things.
Yeah, there's a sort of potential to do all sorts of things at the same time. It's not just it's being ultra efficient with the amount of space and time that we've got. So you wouldn't just be able to kind of grow furniture. You can use those trees to suck up the pollutants, and then, you know, eventually with luck you'd have healthy soil, which then you can then grow. And one of the things we've been trying to do in the orchard is to grow edible things amongst everything else as well. So you can eat raspberries as you're going around, or pluck strawberries from underneath and what have you. Although the birds do tend to eat them quite a bit. Anything that we have that's nice, you do have to share it with. I mean, well, you know, there's lesson number 374 for you there. You know what I mean? But
it's the red currants that they strip off. I know from our own plants, the red currants are first, raspberries come sort of second, black currants kind of last. It's definitely a pecking order for the fruits they like to pick off.
Yeah.
So we've had, would you consider genetically modified trees? You know, another thing that, again, I spoke with Nancy Dinas earlier this week, and with Audrey when she joined last week, is the fact that the way in which one produces furniture when one is growing it, and really the entire sort of biodesign community, we're challenging the historical value propositions, the retail model wherein, you know, you go into a shop and the supplier would effectively usually try to sort of barter with the supplier for the lowest possible price. You know, there is a cost factor involved in obviously making all of this, and there are corners that cannot be cut. You can't cut the time, you can't cut the space, but as you said, the pieces that you're growing, because they are, you know, these are grafted, they're whole pieces, that the joints can't fall off, so they're very robust, and they are therefore heritage pieces. What are your sort of thoughts on some of the ways that we might challenge the value proposition, and how this might help, if you like, inform a new economy, a new bioeconomy, as it were?
Good question.
Big question.
Alice, you got any thoughts on that?
I haven't got a single thought. This is what I was worried about, Melissa. There was going to be lots of fiercely intelligent questions that we've not really even got to starting thinking about. That's what.
Yeah. Well, I have thought about this, but I haven't come to any satisfactory conclusions to some degree. I think the thing is, it's kind of. Like I was saying earlier, for me personally, I've kind of geeked out on a way to create structures using trees, and it's ultra specific, and what Alice has brought to this is looking out into the wider world and how everything's connected to everything else, and what are the effects of that socially and culturally and all the rest of it. But so. That being the case, and realizing just how much we've got to do, you know, we really do have several lifetimes of work ahead of us. But one of the beauties, this is one of the things with the workshops that we do, is actually, instead of us answering that question by saying, well, here are some other ways of doing it that I have no idea of the consequences or how it may pan out. Actually, what we're hoping is that what we're doing is one way of doing it for creating structures, but if people can, if it helps other people think slightly differently about the way that they want to do the thing that they're doing, then hopefully that's the idea. The value proposition isn't for us to it's not for me to say, you know, or any other ways that we could interact.
Yeah.
But we could hopefully, I mean, I don't know whether saying what I'd like to inspire people to think of their own things is all right, but it kind of is, really, I suppose. It's like, this is our way of doing it. Maybe, you know, it's what's yours? What's other people's? So, yeah, we're kind of encouraging that debate, but I can't say as we've got the mental space anymore to come up with any other ideas.
Think about it.
On how to
well,
do
luckily,
it.
when we share the video, and you know, obviously we've got some people joining us live. You know, this is something that obviously the community can think about. I mean, what I'm seeing an analogy with here is that when you look to the indigenous practices of the world, when you look to how indigenous peoples from the tribes of the Amazon to Native Americans to South Asian indigenous communities, the value in the built, the value in vernacular architecture, the value in the things that are created is principally in the information. It's in the exchange of information. It's as a cultural artifact, and within and of that artifact there is a huge amount of information. Usually it's actually embedded not only in the ritualistic practice of the creation of the piece, there's also a high cyclicality to the ways in which indigenous peoples make their architectures and their other items. And then with that, you have the fact that mythologies are all woven into this. And the analogy I see with what you're creating is that, again, this is, we were saying earlier, these pieces have got a lot of information. They've got information that is biological about the environment. They've got environmental data in them. They've got knowledge of the species, in that you're having to work in very different ways to actually create with these species. Then they've obviously got the fact they are part of this wider school, this bio movement, if you like, that are working in entirely different ways to the industrialized mechanistic process. So it strikes me they're an analogy. So we may not have an answer, but maybe if we were to bring in some anthropologists and some other experts in these other value propositions, how do indigenous peoples actually trade? How do they actually make their communities work? Because they are quite different to the way that we do. And the other parallel is that obviously indigenous communities tend to think along much bigger timelines. They tend to think back a lot, in that, like you and like ourselves, they think to ancient times because they perceive of their ancestors as being with them in real time, and that the ancestors' spirit lives on. And then obviously they think cathedral thinking, they think ahead, and so they're not of the moment. It's not all about now, it's not about passing whims and so forth. So I think that maybe, yeah, bring in some anthropologists here and we could maybe expand on this and get a better idea. Now I've got two questions.
Definitely. Oh yeah, sorry.
Sorry, no, you go ahead.
Oh well, I mean, yeah, I definitely love a bit of anthropology personally, and it's been quite a big inspiration for it. One of the, just quickly, because I realise there's questions and stuff, is in the Pacific Northwest. There was the whole kind of, well, obviously before the Europeans arrived, quite an interesting. I don't know enough about it particularly, but I've looked a little bit into it, where instead of agriculture, they kind of tweak the natural world a little bit more. So where the salmon come up the river and stuff, they create pools so it make it easier to catch. And where the blueberries are, you know, they kind of brought mulch from somewhere else in order that encourages blueberries to grow, and subtle shifting. There's definitely tons and tons of examples of people doing this sort of thing, and this is very much directly copied. I wouldn't even say inspired, you know. It's like, yep, we'll have that. So yeah.
Now, as I've said to those that have so far joined us in the series and will, and this is also going out to those that are joining us live today, I'm going to be asking 2 questions of everybody, and I'm going to be compiling the answers when this series finishes. Essentially, the live sessions are curated into series that cover particular topics. So the first question, Gavin's going to love this. This is right in line with your big thinking. The year is 2050. What does the biomaterialized world look and feel like?
Oh. Well, I personally feel it's only just beginning, if I'm honest. So, what do you think, Bea?
Well, yeah, I can. I can only think about next week at the moment. But yeah, I don't know. I I have I feel optimistic about it, but I can't have any sort of concrete ideas of what it is. But I'm naturally an optimist, so I feel that it can be a positive thing, but I don't.
I think it's about social. It's a sort of social issue. Is the fact that we can't, as far as I understand, and I could completely be wrong here, but we can't solve the environmental problems, and including, you know, biodesign, you know, using these things until we have a slightly less disparate, you know, the gap between the rich and the poor, and between men and women, and all of these things. We've got to sort those things out to have more inclusivity and diversity. So then you've got more people being able to think about these things better, as it were. So actually, it's kind of like it sort of depends on how the political thing goes, and if we can go in the right direction by 2050, we could be doing all sorts of absolutely awesome things, not, you know, with a very subtle interaction with the natural world, and having a great time. But it's not about, at the beginning of this project I thought it was about manufacturing, but it's not. It's about who's doing the manufacturing, and for what reasons, and what have you. So
individuals reaching their potential and not being squashed because of the,
you know, at the moment there's,
imbalance,
you know,
of society, and
there's exactly, there's people as you know, as clever as Einstein working in a cotton field, and not without the opportunity to express what they've got to contribute, you know what I mean? So actually,
you actually prompted a thought then. I mean, I was thinking about the fact that a lot of certainly the British government's sort of futures thinking has been very tech-led. It's sort of imagined a world where all kids are coders, and we have all sorts of gadgets. If you look at the budget as it's structured, although there is some finance for film and developing the British film industry and so forth, there is a massive budget for tech, but not so much for some areas of science. And what your particular work and the school of which it's part, this is about getting hands-on. This is about getting back to nature. This is about working with species. This is about rolling your sleeves up. And so it is an inherently analog way of working, although there's lots of information in there, and you certainly need to be trained and highly skilled in it. This is not high tech. This is not the sort of light industry that a huge amount of the funding is going into. And obviously that sort of high tech vision of everybody being a coder and a tech whiz, that does alienate a lot of people, because they're not everybody is that way inclined. We are all different. There are many people that actually are, you know, like to be outside, like to be physical. That's how they need to work. So it feels to me that this is what you're doing by its very nature is actually within a really important movement of not just design, but you know, of culture. And that accommodates for what effectively is that gap of the moment, wherein there's a lot of emphasis on certain skills and certain communities and not others. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's just, we need to start thinking like a species. It's just that simple, isn't it? That's the thing. And a species that's part of a bigger natural network. And, you know, but if, you know, there's signs of that happening. There's every reason to be optimistic as well as, you know, fearful. So, you know, but I think it's like all the answers are already there. It's just they're in people that are tired or something.
Yeah, we've had a pandemic, we've got war and whatever is coming next. Yeah.
And I think it's recognizing people's strengths and weaknesses, and biosystems strengths and weaknesses, and not accommodating that, recognizing that that's part of it, and then there might be a strength somewhere else and a weakness somewhere else, and to try and trying to not exert power all the time, and trying to just appreciate and nurture. And there are so many things that we're missing because we're not doing that.
Yeah, nature doesn't necessarily seem to dominating it in that kind of traditional approach that we have. Clearly, isn't always going to work, or if it does, it's very short term. You know, it's about the mind shift, isn't it? Really, it's sort of, and nobody needs to lose status or anything over any of that. You know what I mean? That's the thing. There's sort of, or their place in society. It's there's enough room for everyone. We just kind of organise ourselves up a little better. Anyway, that's a rant for another day. But yeah.
So your last big question, if anyone watching has any questions, do put them in the comments. It's easier for me to see them. There is a little question function, but just write your comment, your question as a comment. So the last question. So if a genie popped out of a magical lamp, or I was thinking in the orchard out of a watering can, and granted you one wish for our BioFutures, that could be your BioFutures or BioFutures generally, what would it be and why?
I think, wow, that's a biggie, isn't it? I think the opportunity for post-scarcity would be awesome. That's the thing. You know, if there's literally enough to go around so there's nothing to fight over, that would be great. That would be absolutely brilliant, because then, you know, we can get on with exploring trees and shapes and things, and you know, and everyone can get on with the thing that they want to do, and that would be lovely. Yeah, the opportunity for everyone to explore their dreams, that would be really cool. I sound like a hippie now, don't I?
Sound like.
And you, Alice?
Right. Well, I just don't know. There are so many directions that my head instantly goes into, and then, you know, and I start quivering about all those other trees that we could have, and yeah, I might sneak in the duck pond and the greenhouse and the horses. That's me personally, but yeah, there's so much potential, and yeah, I couldn't. Yeah.
It'd be great to have the freedom to explore. That's the thing. To not be worrying about all the other factors of life, and literally to be able to focus on bringing geometry and nature together in a beautiful, useful way. That would be living the dream big time. You know, if we won the lottery, that would be it. It's like, yep, well, we could do this all the time. That would be cool.
That sounds wonderful. Yeah. Well, I think if
nice
I've got a wish for the genie myself, I think I want a bio university, where we've got many universities. We have got a number of seminal figures from the university world in this series. You know, but it strikes me that there really is so much to learn and explore here, and there are so many opportunities. It really would be wonderful to have not just a campus, but campuses around the world where we can actually gather all the expertise. We can have people experimenting with this, where you don't have to enroll as a student full time. You can come along as a member of the community, and just creating really the environment so that the skills that are needed to create this can actually be scaled, and so that people can engage with it, not just to understand it, but actually, you know, to learn about nature, to actually sort of get on that sort of journey of being more aware. And of course, because we know that we enjoy being in the environment, don't we? We love being in nature. It's a really satisfying process to be gardening. So I think, yeah, if there is a genie out there, or a supernatural deity, I hope they're listening to all the wishes.
Yeah, it does sound really cool, Melissa. I'm up for that. Yeah,
we're ready.
Yeah, we're
ready. Up for that.
Yeah,
and her Royal Highness Lena has just joined in, so yes, I think Lena the dog has just arrived to
brilliant. Beautiful. Well, you have been absolute superstars. It's been hugely insightful. I've certainly learnt a number of things, particularly the fact that trees they actually record the velocity of the wind effectively. They record if it's been windy, in among other things, in their materiality. And so, you know, just thank you for joining us today, and hope to catch up with you and to visit the orchard when in the UK.
That would be really nice.
When hopefully the weather's a bit better than it's been of late. So thank you for joining us today. This has been recorded, it will be shared, and I'm hoping, just a word of warning, there has been a bit of latency on the audio. I'm fingers crossed this audio is going to be good on video. But thank you to everybody. Bye for now.
Thank you very much.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thanks, Melissa.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.